As is often the case, one's understanding of reality depends on how connected you are with it. As we focus on Europe this evening, we have invited 3 European-born Canadians to help us understand the fateful choices that European governments are making and how their decisions are changing the face of that continent. And so we welcome Robert Jan van Pelt, Professor of Architecture at the School of Architecture at the University of Waterloo; Christina McWebb, Director of Academic Programs at the Stratford campus of the University of Waterloo. She's also a professor in the French Studies Department; and Piotr Wróbel, who is the Chair of Polish History at the University of Toronto. And we are delighted to welcome you 3 European Canadians, which is a term you don't hear very often, to our table here at TVO. Okay, let's get into this, shall we? What is the memory of an event or setting that gives a sense of where you are from and how it connects you to Europe?
Okay, that's quite a loaded question.
It is, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, it is. But first of all, I need to make one small correction.
Please.
I'm actually not a Canadian. And I do not have Canadian citizenship, and perhaps we will get to this topic.
How long have you been here?
25 years. And
that does sound like a good topic for following up, but anyway.
It does, and I would love to talk about it. But
okay.
First, I will answer your question. And I would like to take my own family, actually, as an example. I come from a family of 6, which is a little unusual for Germany, even in the 60s, 70s, when we were, and early 80s, when we were all born, to have that many children.
We should point out, your last name is McWebb.
My last name is McWebb, which is
German.
my married name.
Okay.
No, my maiden name is Schnell, so that is very German, actually.
Okay.
And quite common in Germany. Anyway, I think what I would like to talk about actually is to just take the demographic makeup of my family. So, like I said, there are 6 of us. I have a brother-in-law who is Dutch. I have 2 nephews who are half Dutch and half German. I have another brother-in-law who is French. I have a sister who lives in France. And my own children are half Canadian and half German. And like I said, although it might be a little unusual to come from a family with 6 children, especially in today's Germany, what I think is less unusual is this demographic makeup. And I think even though, especially in the last couple of years, new nationalisms have been emerging, especially much, much stronger even in the last few months, I think Germans and Europeans have integrated a lot more than they often care to believe. And my family, I don't think, is all that unusual.
You are a bit of the European Union just within your own family tree.
Yes, but I'm not a unique example, I don't think. So I guess my point is that the integration has been happening for a long time, and I think it is a lot more widespread within Europe than a lot of Europeans like to admit.
Understood. Robert Jan, where are you born, incidentally?
I'm born in the Netherlands, in Haarlem, near Amsterdam. I came to Canada in '87, so I was in my early 30s. I came for a job at the University of Waterloo, and I did become a Canadian citizen. And actually, my story plays at the time that I became a citizen. It was a very difficult decision for me because I had to give up my Dutch citizenship. I could not keep it. The Dutch don't allow you to keep, when you choose another nationality, you cannot keep your Dutch citizenship. And so this was kind of just traumatic. And I had dinner with a friend of mine who at that time was in the Dutch government. So this was around 2000, 15 years ago. And he was Minister of the Interior. And we go back to university. We knew it very well. He chose politics, I chose academia. And after dinner, he said, I'm actually very envious of you that you're becoming a Canadian. And I thought, why would you be envious? The Dutch, they think that their country is the best in the world. They have 10 weeks of holidays when they start out the job and 12, after 1 year, and you are a cabinet minister. You've made it here, and you're a very important man. And he said, something recently happened here, and I'm very worried about the future of this country. And this is why I would like to leave. And I said, so what happened? He said, suddenly a community of Africans, and I will not mention the nation, has popped up in this country. It's a few 100,000 people big. And I'm the Minister of Interior, and I have no idea where they come from. Which meant that this idea of the beginning of the open border policy was such a shock, the impact of that for a senior politician who helped make that policy. And he was surprised. And so I think what we see now, 15 years later, of course, is the ultimate consequence of this, is that not only a government minister who has inside information is in fear, but everyone is in fear. Well, I'm sitting here in Canada, and I mean, let's be honest, we've just had an election and we have different views, if you're conservative, liberal, or NDP or Green, about how we should protect our borders, our immigration policy, refugee policy, but at least there is still a sense that whatever government there is here, that actually it can decide what that policy will be and that this policy can be enforced. And I think Europeans have lost that confidence, and that's, I think, why the continent's in trouble.
Piotr,
I'm more optimistic about Europe than you are.
tell everybody where you're born, first of all.
I was born in Warsaw, Poland, and I spent the first 35 years of my life in Poland. I was raised there, I was educated there, so I consider myself a European. I go to Poland or to Europe quite frequently. I stay in touch, and I believe that now, living in the so-called global village, we have to follow European affairs, because without proper knowledge about Europe, we are lost in our world. So this is why Europe is very important to me as well.
As you look at Europe today, Russia and Ukraine, Greece and its financial problems, other members of the EU and their financial problems, the massive flow of refugees now from the Middle East to Europe, how would all right, I take your point about how fearfully Europe looks at these challenges right now, Robert Jan. But Christine, let me ask you, how do you think Europe looks at these 21st century challenges and how it intends to react to them?
I think that it's a split. I think on the one hand, there is a lot of fear, like you were saying, and I'm not as pessimistic as you about it either, but there is a lot of fear. I mean, when we look at recent events with the Pegida movement, which is growing, and with
Just take a second to explain what that is.
Sorry, yeah, so the Pegida movement is, well, it was founded in Dresden, in East Germany, and has traditionally been particularly strong in that area. However, I mean, it is certainly spreading across Germany, and it is essentially a patriotic party that's trying to fight the Islamization of Germany. And so we have demonstration
Of Europe.
Of Europe,
They
sorry.
have Europe
yes.
in their name.
Yes. So we have demonstration by that group, and we have demonstrations of the extreme right-wing groups all across Europe, not just in Germany, obviously. At the same time, we have just as many counter-demonstrations as we have demonstrations. So I really do think that Germany and the other European countries are very split in terms of the general atmosphere. So I think on the one hand, there is a lot of optimism, which we have also seen. I will refer to Germany because that's the situation I know best, but in other countries as well, the whole Willkommenskultur, so the culture of welcoming foreigners and refugees into the countries. I mean, that has been very strong.
We've
and
got
still
some
is
numbers
quite
on
strong.
that. Can I show you these numbers,
Yes,
Christine? Let's
sure.
bring these up if we could. You want to see who in Europe is particularly happy with the thought of who ought to be welcomed? Look who's at the top of the list there. Germany, then Italy and Spain, and go down the list. What did you call it again, auf Deutsch?
Willkommenskultur.
Willkommenskultur,
It's
a welcoming culture.
Yeah, welcoming culture.
And the UK down there at the bottom. Now, I wonder, you said before you were a little more optimistic about the way Europe is handling these problems. Is that because none of these nationalistic right-wing groups has actually yet won an election and taken power? You heartened by that?
Well, I'm more optimistic because Europe is a big continent in spite of all, and there are different situations in different parts of Europe. And yes, some European countries are going through a difficult period, but for instance, the Polish economy grew by 1/3 during the last 20 years, not 20 years, since 2007, by 1/3.
That's massive.
It's massive. And a similar thing happened in other countries in Central Europe. So Czechs, Hungarians, Croatians, Slovenes are pretty optimistic as well. Immigration, refugees, this is a different problem, and we are going to talk about this. But generally speaking, I believe there are happy parts of Europe, and they don't share your pessimism and
deep pessimism.
deep pessimism, because things there are actually quite all right.
Well, he's just reflecting his fellow countrymen's views. Let's look at this. If we look at the numbers published more carefully by The Guardian, 42% of Germans strongly agree with the notion that they have a duty to welcome refugees. 42%. 24% of your fellow Dutch feel that way. How do you explain the difference?
First of all, the Netherlands is a much smaller country. I mean, there's always been, of course, in the Netherlands a kind of suspicion that major decisions are made outside of the Netherlands. Especially when I grew up in Bonn, we saw ourselves as a kind of province of Germany. I think that's one thing. The second thing is that, of course, the Dutch have been in the 1960s and 70s, were on the forefront, the avant-garde of emancipation, of tolerance, and so on. And what they see is, I think, an immigration that is unwilling to accept those values. And the Dutch very much identify with the values of tolerance and welcoming the stranger, going back to the 17th century when it was a country of refuge for Jews, for free thinkers, and so on. I think that is one of the major issues, that they fear that the key piece of what it means to be a Dutchman today, which is embracing what we would call very liberal, progressive values, is not shared by these groups that are immigrating into the country, that they're not integrated, and that there seems to be no real agenda or tool to integrate these new immigrants. And I think that makes people worried.
Were you, I guess I should find out, how surprised were you when the chancellor of your former homeland, or I guess, is it still your current homeland?
No, this is my homeland.
Canada is your homeland. Okay, your original country though.
Yeah.
She believes that her country will be able to handle almost anything that comes its way. How surprised does that make you to hear that?
You mean in terms of the refugee
Yeah.
crisis? Yes. Having followed the politics of Angela Merkel, I'm not all that surprised. I think, first of all, I think we have to look at her own origin. I mean, she has always been coming from East Germany and having lived through the kind of suppressive culture that she grew up in, and knowing German history, where, I mean, a lot of Germans, where millions of Germans were taken in by other countries. So I think, in part, this motivates her own policies. I think, though, that she is also considering this as a longer-term, I don't want to say solution, but perhaps something that Germany can benefit from, which is investment, which is allowing, especially Syrian refugees, to come into the country, because as we all know, the birth rate in Germany is very low, and it's not looking like it's going to go up. They're saying it's going to go up from 1.4 to 1.6 children per woman, which is nothing, which means that by 2060, the German population will have shrunk down to 65 to 70 million. So in a way, especially refugees that are educated, and quite a high percentage of Syrian refugees are educated, could bring a lot of relief for that kind of situation economically.
We have heard that. Piotr,
Yeah.
let me get you to comment on that. We have heard older people in Germany say it's actually kind of neat that all of these young people with their young children are coming to revitalize our very old towns, and who knows, maybe they'll get jobs and pay for our pensions.
Not only in Germany, the mayor of Baltimore asked for thousands of refugees because Baltimore is kind of dying out. So it's not only a German situation that cheap labor is welcome. But returning to your pessimistic or less pessimistic evaluations, look, history of mankind is a history of migrations, and we cannot change it. And we have to remember that societies which assimilate migrants, immigrants successfully are very successful. Mm-hmm. And societies which are unable to integrate newcomers are doomed to fail.
So, can I just interject? I would just like to say that I did not talk about cheap labor. I was not at all referring to the situation of the Gastarbeiter back in the 70s and the guest workers in the 70s and the 80s. Not at all. I was not talking about cheap labor. I was talking about educated people coming into the country, being integrated into professional jobs. And we already have quite a bit of evidence from Greece, for example. I mean, a lot of doctors have come from Greece and have found employment in Germany.
Yeah, but most Afghans coming to Germany are illiterate.
What about the Syrians?
Syrians cannot read Latin script quite frequently, but this is not a problem. We are a melting pot. Angela Merkel, and I'm not kidding now, it's not a joke, Angela Merkel had a Polish grandfather. So this is this melting pot of Europe, and we have to accept it. And people who try to stop this, to avoid this, are doomed. They have no chance.
Robert Jan.
Yeah, I disagree with Piotr, respectfully, of course, but very respectfully. But I think that if you look at, I mean, there are two variables. The first is time. You know, if you have a century, it's a very different story than if you have a decade or less. And I think right now there's a pressure cooker in Europe. People have to assimilate very quickly. But the more important thing is that if we're looking at societies, modern societies, contemporary societies, that are basically immigrant societies, and Canada is a good example, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, what they have in common, of course, is that they do not have a very well-developed welfare state or at all.
But they are doing very, very well.
Yeah, but the thing is, but for Europe, my sense is that for Europe to become able to assimilate all of these immigrants, they will have to basically take away the welfare system for this to work. And Europeans will not accept that. Or you get a two-tier system where the welfare state only basically applies to the people who have been born there, but it doesn't apply to the immigrants. But to have an immigrant population coming in a system in which basically everyone is taken care of,
I don't think you can afford it.
Sorry?
Can't afford it?
I don't think it can afford it, but I also think that it actually creates social tensions. That in a sense, when we talk about Canada or the United States, that the immigration, that insofar as immigration could be perceived as a problem, it doesn't happen because we do not see that the immigrants are taking away certain kind of benefits which we have, because we actually do not have them. We have very few, even when we think that we're so much better than the US.
Piotr.
Well, I agree that this will be difficult, but this is absolutely necessary to go through this. And you are mentioning a very interesting phenomenon. Australia, the United States, Canada are citizens states. Here in Toronto, your ethnic background doesn't really matter. We are here, at least at the University of Toronto, in the post-national narrative. I don't care what's the ethnic background of my students as long as they write good papers and exams and speak good English. In Europe, though, this is still not over. And there, nationalism is quite important still. And this is the problem.
I want to pick up on that, and I want to put it to you as a follow-up, because Robert, I hope I'm saying it right, Winnicki, member of the right-wing national movement, freshly minted member of the Polish parliament, had this to say. You know where I'm going with this. We don't want multiculturalism in Poland. We have not agreed to any Muslim immigrants in Poland. Poland is to remain a Slavic and a Christian country. How widely shared is that attitude in Poland?
National movement, and this gentleman represents national movement, is not a strong party. They entered parliament through a back door, invited by some other movement. Every country has a movement like this. We mentioned Pegida. We could talk about Alternative for Germany and several other parties like this. So it's normal in every country because people are afraid. The world is changing very quickly now. And to many people, this change is overwhelming and really scary. And there are things which change without visible signs. And here you have this very concrete, easy to notice thing, immigrants, fresh people. And this is why it's so easy to mobilize scared people using this trick. But this is a trick. Yes, we have a new government in Poland right now. It's a populist government. We worry a bit about it. But I would not exaggerate with this huge threat coming from Pegida, Alternative for Germany, National Movement, and other parties in Europe. It has always been so.
Robert Jan, how concerned do you think we ought to be by these strong nationalist movements that are blowing through Europe
Obviously,
right now?
I'm much more concerned, and I think that one of the reasons is actually the structure of European politics. I mean, proportional representation always favors extremist parties. In Canada, we basically, because it's a first past the post system, and the same happens in Britain. In order to win a riding, you need to always to drift to the center, because that's where you pick up the votes you need, if you're on the left or the right. And in Europe, you can, with 5% to 3%, you can be elected in parliament. And at a certain moment, and this is what happened to the Nazis in the 20s, and at a certain moment you can just be sitting there as a small party, but you have a platform. You are basically legitimate as a political party. And I think so. My worry is that we've seen it in France with Le Pen. The National Front has been sitting in parliament for decades and nobody took notice of it, and suddenly it's breaking out. And the possibility of a National Front government or a National Front presidency has become actually very close.
Except that father and daughter aren't speaking to each other anymore, and the whole thing is blowing up.
It doesn't seem to matter to the electorate.
So do you expect a biblical catastrophe?
No, the biblical catastrophe is already happening if you literally look at the images coming. I mean, this is basically the Ten Commandments in action, you know, the stream of refugees, which of course is the other side to it, how everything is actually choreographed and visible.
I've got a question for Christine on that front. We had Josef Joffe on this program not too long ago. Here he is writing back in September in Die Zeit the following: "For centuries, to be German was to be tethered to one's origins, ancestry, faith, language. This country is developing now a modern understanding of nationhood. To be German is no longer about being, but about becoming. It is no longer about biology, but about an act of will. The way millions have become Americans, Australians, or Canadians. Origins pale in favor of the future." How do you like the sound of that?
I really like the sound of that. Actually, I do think that the comparison to countries like Canada, Australia, and America is a bit of a stretch, just because, like we were saying, I mean, they're essentially immigrant countries and have a fairly good integration policy, which Europe has, I think, has a long way to go in most countries for that.
But Germany's still going to be German for a long time.
But he's absolutely right. I mean, it's the German citizenship is, and this is the reason why I'm not a Canadian. German citizenship is tied to traditionally blood and not territory, right? And just like in Holland, I would have to give up my German citizenship. But in the year 2000, and I think this is perhaps also what he's referring to, citizenship law has been changing, and it is becoming much more a mirror of the demographic reality that is Germany, where, like I said, there are 10%, 8 million people in Germany are foreign-born, and not to mention the guest workers who are now guest workers. I mean, what an insult, right? I mean, who are now, in many cases, in their third generation. I mean, they're as German as any other German.
And still not citizens.
And they are not citizens. Yeah. So the government has taken steps forward to relax the citizenship laws, whereby German expats like myself can now have dual citizenship in some cases, as do foreigners living in Germany, or if you want to call them
so-called foreigners.
So-called foreigners living in Germany, as long, I mean, there's some laws, some rules that apply. They have to have been there for a certain number of years and that kind of thing. But at least it is possible, so I think it's moving in the right direction.
Let me find out from Piotr. Do you think that Germans or Poles want to be more like Canadians or Australians?
I don't know, because individual people want different things. But returning to Germany, this is history as well, that hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of non-Germans became Germans during the last 1,000 years, right? I mentioned Polish background of Angela Merkel. You go to the Rhineland and every third last name is Polish. The most attractive host on German TV, Marietta Slomka, is not a very German name. So this has been happening to Germany, to every country, for a very, very, very long time. and this is absolutely normal. And if Germany wants to be a very successful, modern country comparable to the United States, to Australia, Canada, it has to be a citizens' state, not a national state. And they are going through this with some problems. And further to the east, these problems are even larger and more difficult to overcome. But they will do this. And it's always a matter of attitude, because imagine there are 40,000 Vietnamese in Warsaw. Has anybody complained about them? Not really. So it's a matter of education, it's a matter of attitude, it's a matter of proper policies, and I deeply believe that Europe will be able to assimilate these people, and they will be Europeans.
Time flies when we're having fun. We have a minute left. Robert Jan, do you think Germans and Poles and the Dutch want to be more multicultural as nations?
I think so, yes, but I think they don't really know how to do it. And in some way, I think their own legacy is in the way. And the other thing is, and I think the most important is, it's an incredible failure, I think, of the political elites. And I think that Merkel, in some ways, going on her own right now. She has incredible courage, but that generally the political elites, and ultimately they are important in shaping an agenda of a society, have been unable to articulate and verbalize a vision. And I think that is what Europe needs more than anything else. It needs to be done both at the national level, and I think that Merkel, with her statement, "We can do it," is making a first stab at it. But I think it needs to be done also at the European level. And until there is a narrative, something like Lincoln at Gettysburg, or something like Dr. Martin Luther King, somebody who can articulate the vision for Europe as a whole, I don't think they're going to get there.
Wie sagt man auf Deutsch? We can do it? What does she say?
Wir schaffen es.
Wir schaffen es. Okay. We've learned a little Deutsch tonight. Very good. Can I thank Robert Jan van Pelt from the University of Waterloo, Christine McWebb, also from the University of Waterloo, Stratford campus, and Piotr Wrubel from the University of Toronto for being on our program tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Talk to you about your citizenship later. You need to work on that.
I'm in the process. I am in the process.
That's it. That's it.
So short.
Blame Vodek. Blame Vodek. He wanted Neil Ferguson on. Okay.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.